Hello and welcome. Today's talk is titled, Why Fear Death? And also, How Not to Fear Death. And I am Rick Hoffman. From almost any viewpoint, this topic involves a difficult discussion, particularly in the Western world. In the Far East, Tibetan Buddhism has spent 1,000 years examining dying, death, and the afterlife. Their guide, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, its real goal is to help aspirants achieve nirvana during this lifetime. However, if that does not occur, then the lifestyle, values, and meditation practices can culminate in liberation at time of death or while journeying in the intermediate state, the period between death and entering a womb for rebirth. The Dalai Lama has said, normally in our lives, if we know that we are going to be confronted by a difficult or unfamiliar situation, we prepare and train ourselves for such a circumstance in advance, so that when this event actually happens, we are fully prepared. Death is such an event, for each of us blessed by being alive. My intent in offering a talk on this topic is both personal and a prayer to be of service to my fellow humans, particularly for those of us who are neither the recipients of this tradition nor have the guidance of an accomplished practitioner and teacher of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Jumping right in, what dies at death? Certainly the body dies, and with the death of the body, there are no senses to perceive the world. So the world dies too. What happens to us? If you are a materialist, if you believe you are a product of biology, then you die too. Kaput. No more existence. Wiped out. Terminated. And if this is your view, then you have much to fear from death. But is this belief true? Is it even your own experience? Remember that a belief is a conclusion prior to proving or knowing. And what is your proof? As to your own experience, every night in deep sleep, there is no world and no mind, yet you still are. At the moment of conception, when an egg is fertilized, consciousness is present and providing order as cells divide, develop, and organize, long before a brain or a mind exist. At the birth of the universe, be it by a Big Bang or any other mechanism, consciousness was present and order ruled the day, or the universe would be nothing more than random matter hurtling and colliding in space. So when is consciousness not present? And if consciousness is ever present, where could we go where consciousness would be absent? Which leads to two questions. The first is, if we don't die with the death of the body, who or what survives? Then the second question, which we will examine right away, is, what proof do we have that anyone or anything continues? What is the evidence from beyond the grave that supports the belief or the reality of reincarnation? Working with thousands of case studies of children who vividly remember past lives at the University of Virginia, the most startling are those who carry physical characteristics from one lifetime to another. There are children who remember being shot to death in a previous life whose bodies show a scar as if a bullet had entered the body with an opposing exit scar. How mind-boggling. Such children talk matter-of-factly about the afterlife. Over 100 children from the University of Virginia study report that they didn't go directly to heaven, but had to wait in another place first, which corresponds to the crossing over phase. They report making decisions about their next lifetime once they got to heaven, choosing a new family, and new challenges. As one girl put it, heaven isn't easy. You have to work there. Because they are often so young, children who report past lives are the strongest evidence that reincarnation isn't just a cultural artifact. There is also the convincing matter of convergence. All three categories of witnesses, children who remember past lives, people who have had a near-death experience, and people who have experienced being out of their body, generally agree on how the afterlife works. In Tibetan Buddhism, one lifetime is firmly connected to another. When certain lamas die, it's expected that their reincarnation will be found. Signs are left behind that link the two incarnations. On the return, the baby will recognize personal objects, and the adults around can determine beyond doubt that the chain of identity has not been broken. His Holiness the Dalai Lama is the 14th incarnation of the Nyingma order. Child prodigies are perhaps another signpost for the reality of reincarnation. Whether musical abilities, facility with language, and other gifts that would not have had the life experience to appear are present and blooming. Now, let's delve into the other question. If we don't die with the death of the body, who or what survives? Let's start with who is living this life. Both Hinduism and Buddhism ascribe the cycle of existence, or rise of the person, as the result of the misapprehension or non-apprehension of reality, otherwise known as ignorance, not knowing our true nature. This fundamental ignorance is the cause of the manifesting of the subtle body, which is the apparent entity that transmigrates from death to rebirth. The subtle body is what enlivens the physical form, and its absence is known as death. Hence, the subtle body is what allows the senses to function, the organs of action to act, and physiology to take place. The other aspect or face of the subtle body is the subtle mind, the powers of discrimination, emotion, decision, memory, ego, and mind. Awareness, or limitless consciousness, is not born and does not die. What then is the catalyst for ignorance or non-apprehension of our true identity? It appears that limitless consciousness must localize or limit itself so that the journey to self-discovery can occur. But even so, why does this setup, and it is a setup, exist? In Hindu theology, the answer is God's play. Probably as good an answer as any. Ultimately, limitless consciousness, appearing as a limited consciousness, recognizes itself, and samsara, or cyclic existence, or birth, death, and rebirth, ceases. Did you ever notice that although dreams are nothing but our own thoughts, the only way for us to know them is to fall asleep and appear as a character within our own dream? Similarly, it would appear that limitless consciousness, as if forgetting itself, progresses from not knowing to the rise of the subtle body, to the formation of a physical world in which it appears to take birth, to then grow, age, and die away, only to repeat the process until self-realization or self-recognition occurs. Human birth is said to represent the best or most efficacious body-mind complex to gain this understanding, such as the blessing of human birth. The Tibetan Book of the Dead is a manual for meditative practices under the auspices of an accomplished teacher for realization in this lifetime. However, if this understanding does not take place, then these practices and teachings can fructify during the opportunities presented by death, and the intermediate state, and before emergence into a future existence. If, while dreaming, one comes to know it as a dream, one wakes up. The Tibetan Book of the Dead states that at any moment during the intermediate state, and particularly during transitions, if one recognizes that these subtle experiences are nothing but mind, or mind created, or consciousness, then one awakens to reality. So if this is your understanding, what is there to fear in dying? Transmigration ends, as if the air had been drained from the tires and the fuel used up. There is no karmic energy to propel and no one to travel. Now, as to the particulars of dying, death, and thereafter, according to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, when death approaches and one's last breath is imminent, sit in the yogic posture with hands on the knees. If one cannot sit, then lie on the right side. At the lower extremity, below the navel, one should visualize a brilliant white seminal point, which is the essence of awareness, radiant and clear, breathing and rhythmically, continuously pulsating and on the verge of ascending. In the space above the crown of the head, one should visualize one's spiritual teacher or the Lord, full of joy and ready to assist in guiding and directing the rise of the subtle body. If one expires in this state, it will be like a stream meeting the main river, and liberation will be instantaneous. This is called the pure conscience transference into reality. If the deceased has not recognized reality at the moment of death, then once the vital energy has emerged through one of the orifices of the body, consciousness suddenly becomes awake and lucid. The individual may not know that death has transpired. The mourners are seen as before, and their cries of sorrow can be heard. During this period, before bewildering experiences related to past actions have arisen, the oral teachings of the Tibetan Book of the Dead should be given, but most of us have neither exposure nor training nor the guidance of a qualified master to offer direction. Know with certainty that when your subtle mind and body separate, whatever terrifying or mesmerizing or beautiful images may arise, they are the natural luminosities and natural sounds of your own actual consciousness. Therefore, recognize them. Do not be afraid. Do not be terrified. Do not be awed. The body that you now have is called a mental body. It is the product of subtle propensities and not a solid corporal body of flesh and blood. Therefore, whatever sounds, lights, or rays may arise, they cannot harm you, for you are beyond death now. It is enough that you simply recognize them as manifestations of your own consciousness. Know this to be the intermediate state. If you do not now understand this essential point of the teaching, you will continue to roam within the cycles of existence. If, however, you can recognize that this intrinsic awareness, this brilliant essence of your own consciousness, is reality itself, then you will abide as that reality. As to the crossing over and how the afterlife dawns, the physical body stops functioning. The dying person may not be aware of it, but eventually knows that death has occurred. The physical world vanishes. This can happen by degrees. There can be a sense of floating upward or of looking down on familiar places as they recede. The dying person feels lighter, suddenly free of limitation. The mind and sometimes the senses continue to operate. Gradually, what is perceived becomes non-physical. A presence grows that is felt to be divine. This presence can be clothed in light or in a body of angels or gods. it can communicate to the dying person. Personality and memory begin to fade, but the sense of I remains. This I has an overwhelming sense of moving on to another phase of existence. People who are disconnected from themselves will be baffled by the afterlife, as they are by the present. Feelings of being alienated, alone, victimized, tossed around by fate, out of control, creates a fog of confusion. They cannot take responsibility for their motives and desires, and the afterlife may frighten or baffle them. In the crossover stage, one's karma unravels like a thread coming off a spool, and the events of a lifetime march in review across the screen of the mind. You re-experience your significant moments with vividness and clarity, showing you exactly what each one meant, with no excuses or rationalizations. You become responsible for everything you did. They are all self-judgments, not divine edicts. You find yourself in worlds that reflect the kind of reward or punishment that you believe your actions deserve. You remain in each realm only as long as karma dictates. During this passage, you will learn about yourself and come to your own conclusions. Time is purely subjective, and what you are actually experiencing is your own mind working out dilemmas and conflicts. Understanding, symbolized by light, begins to dawn. In clarity, you realize that I am is your basis, not the things you did. You no longer identify with being a certain person. You now identify with being conscious. And what fills the mind are fresh possibilities. The karma you brought into the last lifetime has been exhausted, and fresh seeds of karma are ready to sprout. Researchers often call this the interlife phase, a transition between the mental state of being alive and the mental state realizing that one has passed on. Not all near-death experiences go into the light. Many experience a judgment scene that can be quite harsh or even hellish, or it can be full of satisfaction. These images clearly depend on the culture they reflect. Houston Smith, an expert world religions, declares, "Everything we experience in the afterlife is a reflection of our own mental machinations." Christians see Christian images, not Buddhist ones, and Muslims see Islamic images. Despite the fact that the realms of cyclic existence are in the absolute sense empty in nature, mere projections of the mind's delusions, on a relative level, the suffering of beings trapped there is undeniable. Westerners argue over whether the afterlife could be as real as the physical world. Easterners declare that both are mental projections. Westerners limit the human life cycle to a short span between birth and death. The East sees a cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. Although I have not divided this talk into two parts, if you wish to pause, reflect, or pick up later, this is a natural time to do so. Otherwise, we will continue. Until this century, the burden of proof in spiritual matters lay with disbelievers. Religion had such a powerful hold upon the human imagination that for whole cultures, the material world was much less real than the world of gods or God. Most modern people can barely fathom this worldview because we are as immersed in materialism as they were in idealism, the belief that nature begins in subtle realms of spirit. Science did not overturn this view by disproving it. Idealism was simply outmoded by a new worldview, materialism, that was more practical. Materialism brought about technology with its attendant comforts, and explain many phenomena that religion preferred to regard as a mystery known only to God. Like any worldview, the old one overstepped when it claimed that diseases were acts of God to punish sinners. Once germs were discovered, this explanation seemed pointless and ultimately irrational. But by the same token, the new worldview would overstep when science claims that without physical proof, we can abolish all notions of God, angels, ghost, spirit, the soul, and the afterlife itself. Just as religion had no competency in physics and chemistry, science has no competency in spiritual issues. The burden of proof has shifted, and now it is believers who must prove that God and the soul are real. This leaves most people in a quandary, dividing their allegiances between faith regarding spirituality and science regarding the material world. There is another way to bridge this divide. If the universe is self-aware, and thus consciousness is everywhere, then there would be nowhere to go after we die that is other than consciousness. It's fair to say that physics never set out to prove that the universe is self-aware. But so many mysteries remain unsolved if the universe isn't self-aware that cutting-edge theories include this once unthinkable idea. The question becomes, can these two worldviews, materialism and metaphysical idealism, be unified? Towards this end, allow me to share a proclamation from Heisenberg, master of quantum mechanics. The first gulp from the glass of natural sciences will turn you into an atheist. But at the bottom of the glass, God is waiting for you. And may I add, God as consciousness. To find out where matter and energy come from, physics posits a universal field that envelops not just what we observe, but everything that could possibly exist. Modern physics finds it easy to make the material world disappear into nothingness. But that is deeply disturbing, almost as disturbing as the disappearance of a dying person. First, a rock, a tree, or a planet disappeared from sight when scientists realized that solid matter is made up of atoms that cannot be detected by the naked eye. Second, atoms disappeared when it was discovered they are made up of energy, mere vibrations in the void. Finally, energy disappeared when it was found that vibrations are temporary excitations in a field, and that the field itself doesn't vibrate but maintains a flat, constant 0 point. The 0 point exists here and now. It provides the starting point from which everything in the universe springs. Since matter and energy are constantly emerging and then vanishing back into the void, the 0 point serves as the switching station between existing and the unmanifest. Newton had established that matter and energy cannot be destroyed, but they can oscillate in this shadowy way at the subatomic level, as long as the sum total of matter and energy isn't altered. Matter and energy have to disappear. If they remained stable, which is how rocks, trees, and planets look to the eye, chaos would break loose. Matter would exist only as randomly floating particles in interstellar space. Exploded bits of the Big Bang would be flying apart at millions of miles an hour without any relationship to one another. There would be no forms, no evolution, no organization. In other words, no universe as we know it. The fact that chaos doesn't totally dominate remains a huge mystery, which may only be solved by consciousness. Thinking, the basic operation of the mind, organizes reality to make sense. The universe does this physically. It forms complex systems like DNA. Genes didn't create life, simply by stringing simple molecules along a double helix. There are spaces between each genetic bit. And this sequencing is all important. An amoeba differs from a human being in the sequence of carbon, oxygen, hydrogen along its genes, not in the atoms themselves. The fact that empty spaces or gaps between genetic material are so important brings us back to the void, where something is arranging random events so that they are meaningful. There are other things the mind can do that are paralleled in the universe. The mind can keep track of two events separated in time. This is how we recognize a face today that we saw years ago. Similarly, the universe keeps track of any two paired electrons. They will be paired throughout manifestation, even if they travel millions of light years apart. Uncannily, if one of the paired electrons should change its position or spin, its twin will change simultaneously without sending a signal that needs to travel through space. All of this implies that the universe consciously knows what it is doing when DNA creates an amoeba, for example, instead of a chimpanzee or a human being. This would suggest self-awareness on the part of molecules, and that in turn requires the zero-point field to act like a mind as it organizes every possible fluctuation in the cosmos. No matter how closely one draws the parallels, this premise cannot be proven or disproven because the zero-point field, by containing everything, contains us. We cannot step outside it, and so we are in the same position as a fish trying to prove that the ocean is wet. Unless the fish jumps out of the ocean, water is everywhere. There is no contrast, and therefore no dryness that makes wetness possible. We cannot prove that the universe has a mind because we aren't mindless. We cannot know the universe as an object of knowledge because we are the universe. And so, if energy and matter are essentially information, does science accept that there is no significant difference between information and knowledge? If there is a difference, what is it? And if there is no difference, then every particle, molecule, object is knowledge. As far as we know, knowledge takes place in mind. So if everything, including the universe, is knowledge, then it must be taking place in a universal or cosmic mind. The problem of materialism goes away. The distinctions between knower, known, and knowledge go away. And the separation of objects becomes known as only an appearance, not reality. And thus the individual self will be recognized as one non-dual self or limitless consciousness. According to Max Planck, the founder of quantum physics, all matter originates and exists only by virtue of a force. We must assume behind this force a conscious and intelligent mind. This mind is the matrix of all matter. What if our minds could alter the quantum field? Then we would have a link between the two models, mind and matter. By now, the public is well aware that research on prayer has validated that it works. In a typical experiment, volunteers, usually from church groups, are asked to pray for sick people in the hospital. They do not visit the person and often have only a number rather than a name. The prayer isn't specific. They are simply asked to pray for God's help. The results have been startlingly positive. In the best-known one at Duke University in North Carolina, patients who were prayed for recovered faster and with fewer side effects than those not prayed for. The Vedic rishis began with consciousness as primary, as the ground, as being, as existence, as all that is and all that can ever be. Consciousness is primary to every phenomenon in nature, as the gap that exists between every electron, every thought, every instant in time. The gap is the reference point, the stillness at the heart of creation, where the universe correlates all events. All observers are inside the field of consciousness, and whatever they do causes the whole field to respond, the interdependence of all things in Buddhism. Therefore, we are not falsifying the universe to describe it as behaving like ourselves. The predictable and the unpredictable coexist. Microcosm, macrocosm are not two. All interactions in the visible universe, inclusive of matter, energy, and information, are reflections of a far more important invisible relationship. We find ourselves at the point where many explanations based on randomness no longer satisfy. A shift must be made to a more conscious explanation. Why do photons fire in a television? Because they turn into a picture. Why do photons fire in the cosmos? For the same reason. Preceding quantum physics by many centuries, the Vedic rishis said that time and space are projections from and on the screen of consciousness. Rupert Spira says, mind is awareness in motion. Awareness is mind at rest. Awareness knowing of its own being is the simplest, most obvious, intimate, and ordinary experience which all people have in common. In fact, it is not an experience that a person has. Awareness is the experiencing element in all experience. It is awareness that has the experience of being aware. That is, it is this same awareness that knows itself in each of us. The simple knowing of our own being, its knowing of itself in us, shines in the mind as the knowledge I am or I am aware, and in our feelings as the experience of peace, happiness, or love. The limited awareness known as the mind and the apparent separate self or ego upon whom it is predicated is an activity rather than an entity. The separate self is what we do, not what we are. Bodhidharma said, once you stop clinging and let things be, you'll be free even of birth and death. Bodhidharma also said, one clings to life, although there is nothing to be called life. Another clings to death, although there is nothing to be called death. In reality, there is nothing that is born, meaning a separate entity. Consequently, there is no one to perish. When we took our first breath, even though we don't remember, we were aware. When we take our last breath, we will be aware. That awareness that was before life began, and that will be when life is no more, is who we are. Limitless, formless awareness. Our true nature, reality itself, Buddha nature, applicable at the moment of death. Buddha said, awaken, be the witness of your own thoughts, perceptions, feelings, sensations. You are not what you observe. Huang Po said, come to know the nature of your own mind, in which there is no self and no other. Let's hear from a modern-day computer scientist, physicist, and philosopher, Bernardo Kastrup. According to metaphysics, or a non-materialist framework, the brain is merely the image of a self-localization process of mind, analogous to how a whirlpool is the image of a self-localization process of water. The brain doesn't generate mind, in the same way that a whirlpool doesn't generate water. It is the brain that is in mind not the mind in the brain. Physical death is merely a declenching of awareness. I pray that this talk has answered, or at least addressed, the topic. Why fear death? And additionally, how not to fear death. This is my attempt to offer practical advice on death and the afterlife, and show that who we are is consciousness, deathless, immanent, and all there is, transcendent. That our home is ever present as consciousness, and that there is nowhere we can be or go that is other than limitless consciousness. There is no second thing. I must acknowledge as my primary source books for this talk the first complete translation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead and Life After Death by Deepak Chopra. Thank you for watching and listening. May this offering be a boon and offer some guidance for the opportunity that death will provide to each of us. If you wish to see other talks that I have given, go to YouTube videos, enter Rick Hoffman Truth Seeker, and they will appear on my channel. Also, if you wish to contact me, a slide will follow with my email address. Until we meet again, happy trails.